Lysander Spooner was an American lawyer, writer, and philosopher, and in 1882, a short document he wrote titled Natural Law, or the Science of Justice, was published as a pamphlet in Boston and became well known. Unfortunately, it's still not as well known, but it deserves to be. So, in that interest, I'm going to read excerpts from this document, and I will also link to the file which you can download the original pamphlet in its complete form, um, and print out at home, or you can email the file to a copy and print shop or give it to them on a jump drive, and of course they will print it out for you and bind it as well if you'd like. So I will now start quoting from Natural Law, The Science of Justice by Lysander Spooner. Quote, "The science of justice is the science of all human rights, of all a man's rights of person and property, of all of his rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is the science which alone can tell any man what he can and cannot do, what he can and cannot have, what he can and cannot say, without infringing the rights of any other person. It is the science of peace, and the only science of peace, since it is the science which alone can tell us on what conditions mankind can live in peace, or ought to live in peace with each other. These conditions are simply these. First, that each man shall do towards every other all that justice requires him to do, as, for example, that he shall pay his debts, that he shall return borrowed or stolen property to its owner, and that he shall make reparation for any injury he may have done to the person or property of another. The second condition is that each man shall abstain from doing to another anything which justice forbids him to do, as, for example, that he shall abstain from committing theft, robbery, arson, murder, or any other crime against the person or property of another. So long as these conditions are fulfilled, men are at peace, and ought to remain at peace with each other. But when either of these conditions is violated, men are at war, and they must necessarily remain at war until justice is reestablished. Through all time, so far as history informs us, wherever mankind have attempted to live in peace with each other, both the natural instincts and the collective wisdom of the human race have acknowledged and prescribed as indispensable condition obedience to this one only universal obligation, that each should live honestly towards every other. The ancient maxim makes the sum of a man's legal duty to his fellow men to be simply this, quote, to live honestly, to hurt no one, and to give everyone his due, end quote. This entire maxim is really expressed in the single words to live honestly, since to live honestly is to hurt no one and to give everyone his due. It is evidently desirable that men should associate, so far as they freely and voluntarily can do so, for the maintenance of justice among themselves, and for mutual protection against other wrongdoers. It is also in the highest degree desirable that they should agree upon some plan or system of judicial proceedings, which in the trial of causes should secure caution, deliberation, thorough investigation, and, as far as possible, freedom from every influence but the simple desire to do justice. Yet such associations can be rightful and desirable only insofar as they are purely voluntary. No man can rightfully be coerced into joining one or supporting one against his will. His own interest, his own judgment, and his own conscience alone must determine whether he will join this association or that, or whether he will join any. If he chooses to depend, for the protection of his own rights, solely upon himself and upon such voluntary assistance as other persons may freely offer to him when the necessity for it arises. He has a perfect right to do so, and this course would be a reasonably safe one for him to follow, so long as he himself should manifest the ordinary readiness of mankind, in like cases, to go to the assistance and defense of injured persons, and should also himself, quote, live honestly, hurt no one, and give to everyone his due, end quote. For such a man is reasonably sure of always having friends and defenders enough in case of need, whether he shall have joined any association or not. Certainly no man can rightfully be required to join or support an association whose protection he does not desire, nor can any man be reasonably or rightfully expected to join or support any association whose plans or method of proceeding he does not approve, as likely to accomplish its professed purpose of maintaining justice and at the same time itself avoid doing injustice. No objection can be made to these voluntary associations upon the ground that they would lack the knowledge of justice as a science, which would be necessary to enable them to maintain justice and themselves avoid doing injustice. Honesty, justice, natural law is usually a very plain and simple matter, easily understood by common minds. Those who desire to know what it is, in any particular case, seldom have to go far to find it. It is true it must be learned, like any other science, but it is also true that it is very easily learned. Although as illimitable in its applications as the infinite relations and dealings of men with each other, it is, nevertheless, made up of a few simple, elementary principles, of the truth and justice of which every ordinary mind has an almost intuitive perception, and almost all men have the same perceptions of what constitutes justice, or of what justice requires, when they understand alike the facts from where inferences are to be drawn. The dealing of men with men, their separate possessions and their individual wants, and the disposition of every man to demand and insist upon whatever he believes to be his due, and to resent and resist all invasions of what he believes to be his rights, are continually forcing upon their minds the questions: is this act just, or is it unjust? Is this thing mine, or is it his? And these are questions of natural law. The fundamental principles of natural law, that one must not, without just cause, strike or otherwise hurt another, that one must not assume any arbitrary control or domination over another, that one must not, either by force, deceit, or stealth, obtain possession of anything that belongs to another, that if one commits any of these wrongs against another, it is not only the right of the injured to resist and, if need be, punish the wrongdoer and compel him to make reparation, but that it is also the right and the moral duty to assist the injured party in defending his rights and redressing his wrongs. These are fundamental principles of natural law, which govern most important transactions of man with man. In most cases, if not in all, mankind at large, young and old, learn this natural law long before they have learned the meanings of the words by which we describe it. In truth, it would be impossible to make them understand the real meanings of the words if they did not first understand the nature of the thing itself. To make them understand the meanings of the words justice and injustice before knowing the nature of the things themselves would be to make them understand the meanings of the words heat and cold, wet and dry, light and darkness, white and black, one and two, before knowing the nature of the things themselves. Men necessarily must know sentiments and ideas no less than material things, before they can know the meaning of the words by which we describe them. If justice be not a natural principle, it is no principle at all. If it be not a natural principle, there is no such thing as justice. If it be not a natural principle, all that men have ever said or written about it from time immemorial has been said and written about that which had no existence. If it be not a natural principle, all the appeals for justice that have ever been heard and all the struggles for justice that have ever been witnessed have been appeals and struggles for a mere fantasy, a vagary of the imagination, and not for a reality. If justice be not a natural principle, then there is no such thing as injustice, and all the crimes of which the world has been the scene have been no crimes at all, but only simple events like the falling of the rain or the setting of the sun, events of which the victims had no more reason to complain than they had to complain of the running of the streams or the growth of vegetation. If justice be not a natural principle, governments, so called, have no more right or reason to take cognizance of it, or to pretend or profess to take cognizance of it, than they have to take cognizance, or to pretend or profess to take cognizance of any other non-entity. And all their professions of establishing justice, or of maintaining justice, or of regarding justice, are simply the mere gibberish of fools, or the frauds of impostors. But if justice be a natural principle, then it is necessarily an immutable one, and can no more be changed by any power inferior to that which established it than can the law of gravitation, the laws of light, the principles of mathematics, or any other natural law or principle whatever. And all attempts or assumptions, on the part of any man or body of men, whether calling themselves governments or by any other name, to set up their own commands, wills, pleasure, or discretion in the place of justice, as a rule of conduct for any human being, are as much an absurdity, an usurpation, and a tyranny, as would be their attempts to set up their own commands, wills, pleasure, or discretion in the place of any and all the physical, mental, and moral laws of the universe. If there be in nature no such principle as justice, no such principle as men's natural rights of person and property, then all such words as justice and injustice, honesty and dishonesty, all such words as mine and thine, all words that signify that one thing is one man's property and that another thing is another man's property, all words that are used to describe men's natural rights of person or property, all such words are used to describe injuries and crimes, should be struck out of all human languages as having no meanings. All other so-called political principles which men are in the habit of inventing are not principles at all. They are either the mere conceits of simpletons who imagine they have discovered something better than truth and justice and universal law, or they are mere devices and pretenses to which selfish and knavish men resort as means to get fame and power and money. If there be, in nature, no such principle as justice, there is no moral standard, and never can be any moral standard, by which any controversy whatsoever between two or more human beings can be settled in a matter to be obligatory upon either. And the inevitable doom of the human race must consequently be to be forever at war, forever striving to plunder, enslave, and murder each other, with no instrumentalities but fraud and force to end the conflict. If there be no such principle as justice, the world is a mere abyss of moral darkness, with no sun, no light, no rule of duty to guide men in their conduct towards each other. In short, if there be in nature no such principle as justice, man has no moral nature, and consequently can have no moral duty. Why is it that it has not, ages ago, been established throughout the world as the only one law that any man or all men could rightfully be compelled to obey? Why is it that any human being ever conceived that anything so self-evidently superfluous, false, absurd, and atrocious as all legislation necessarily must be, could be of any use to mankind or have any place in human affairs? The answer is that through all historic times, wherever any people have advanced beyond the savage state and have learned to increase their means of subsistence by the cultivation of the soil, a greater or lesser number of them have associated and organized themselves as robbers to plunder and enslave all others who had either accumulated any property that could be seized or had shown by their labor that they could be made to contribute to the support or pleasure of those who should enslave them. These bands of robbers, small in number at first, have increased their power by uniting with each other, inventing warlike weapons, disciplining themselves, and perfecting their organizations as military forces, and dividing their plunder, including their captives, among themselves, either in such proportions as have been previously agreed on, or in such as their leaders, always desirous to increase the number of their followers, should prescribe. The success of these bands of robbers was an easy thing, for the reason that those whom they plundered and enslaved were comparatively defenseless. Being scattered thinly over the country, engaged wholly in trying by rude implements and heavy labor to extort a subsistence from the soil, having no weapons of war, other than sticks and stones, having no military discipline or organization, and no means of concentrating their forces or acting in concert when suddenly attacked. Under these circumstances, the only alternative left them for saving even their lives or the lives of their families was to yield up not only the crops they had gathered and the lands they had cultivated, but themselves and their families also as slaves. Thenceforth their fate was, as slaves, to cultivate for others the lands they had before cultivated for themselves. Being driven constantly to their labor, wealth slowly increased, but all went into the hands of their tyrants. These tyrants, living solely on plunder and on the labor of their slaves, and applying all their energies to the seizure of still more plunder and the enslavement of still other defenseless persons, increasing too their numbers, perfecting their organizations, and multiplying their weapons of war. They extend their conquest until, in order to hold what they had already got, it becomes necessary for them to act systematically and to cooperate with each other in holding their slaves in subjection. But all this they can do only by establishing what they call a government and making what they call laws. All the great governments of the world, those now existing as well as those that have passed away, have been of this character. They have been mere bands of robbers who have associated for purposes of plunder, conquest, and the enslavement of their fellow men. And their laws, as they have called them, have been only such agreements as they have found it necessary to enter into in order to maintain their organizations and act together in plundering and enslaving others, and in securing to each his agreed share of the spoils. Thus, substantially, all the legislation of the world has had its origin in the desires of one class of persons to plunder and enslave others, and hold them as property. Of course, these liberated slaves, as some have erroneously called them, having no lands or other property, and no means of obtaining an independent subsistence, these laws have continued in force for hundreds and in some countries for thousands of years, and are in force today in greater or less severity in nearly all the countries on the globe. The purpose and effect of these laws have been to maintain in the hands of the robber or slave-holding class a monopoly of all lands, and, as far as is possible, of all other means of creating wealth, and thus to keep the great body of laborers in such a state of poverty and dependence as would compel them to sell their labor to their tyrants for the lowest prices at which life could be sustained. The result of all this, that the little wealth there is in the world is all in the hands of a few, that is, in the hands of the law-making, slave-holding class, who are now as much slaveholders in spirit as they ever were, but who accomplish their purposes by means of the laws they make for keeping the laborers in subjection. Thus the whole business of legislation, which has now grown to such gigantic proportions, had its origin in the conspiracies which have always existed among the few, for the purpose of holding the many in subjection, and extorting from them their labor, and all the profits of their labor. And the real motives and spirit which lie at the foundation of all legislation, notwithstanding all the pretenses and disguises by which they attempt to hide themselves, are the same today as they always have been. The whole purpose of this legislation is simply to keep one class of men in subordination and servitude to another. It is the assumption by one man, or body of men, of a right to abolish outright all the natural rights, all the natural liberty of all other men, to make all other men their slaves, to arbitrarily dictate to all other men what they may and may not do, what they may and may not have, what they may and may not be. It is, in short, the assumption of a right to banish the principle of human rights, the principle of justice itself, from off the earth, and set up their own personal will, pleasure, and interest in its place. All this, and nothing less, is involved in the very idea that there can be any such thing as human legislation that is obligatory upon those upon whom it is imposed. End quote. This concludes my reading of excerpts of Natural Law, the Science of Justice by Lysander Spooner. Again, I will link to the file that you can download for free if you want to print it out for yourself to make the pamphlet. Once again, it is just about 8 pages when printed, full size and double-sided. So not very long, but contains some very crucial points that are very relevant still today. And that last word in a previous paragraph that I was misspeaking, extortion, is a key term to understand, because extortion in this context is speaking about taxation. So recognizing that that action of extortion is a violation of our natural rights. It's an act of aggression. It's an act of theft. And so therefore it's immoral and not the proper foundation for social justice. All right, thank you for listening.